Welcome to Four Quarter Lives, a podcast exploring the profound impact of longer lives and careers on everything: countries, companies, couples, and careers. I'm Avivah Wittenberg-Cox, and on this week's Four Quarter Lives, I talk with Briana Gilmore, a policy leader at Uber, whose work sits at the intersection of disability, mobility, access, and aging. This is one of those conversations that really shifts your frame. Briana brings a background in disability advocacy, health policy, and urban systems thinking to a question that matters more and more in aging societies. What happens when we stop thinking about older adults simply as a senior market and start asking whether the systems around them actually allow them to move, connect, and participate? In her telling, aging isn't just a demographic issue, it's an access issue. We talk about self-efficacy, autonomy, the tension between safety and independence, and the dignity of risk that families and institutions too often want to take away from older people and disabled people. We also explore Uber as a surprisingly rich case study in longevity innovation, from older adult products and simple mode to medical transportation, family systems, older drivers, and the role mobility platforms might play in building genuinely age-friendly communities. It's a smart, expansive conversation about what longer lives require from companies, cities, and all of us. So Briana Gilmore, welcome to Four Quarter Lives.
Avivah, thanks so much for inviting me. I'm excited to be with you for today.
I think this is going to be a really interesting case study conversation of a company that almost everybody's familiar with because they use it so extensively. But I want to start perhaps with you first and a little bit about your background. You describe yourself first and foremost as a disability advocate long before your work in tech. So maybe start by telling us a bit about your journey through policy, public health, urban planning. You've done a lot of things. How did that eventually get you to Uber?
Sure, yeah. It's been a winding journey. My passion has always
They often are.
Yeah. My passion has always been global politics, actually. And so early on, I was really most interested in the ways that food and water policy impacted migration. My early research projects I worked on looked at the ways that price supports to American farmers, for example, have instigated decades-long demographic shifts and environmental and dietary changes.
That's very relevant today, again.
It's very relevant today, again, of course, and also strangely relevant to my work at Uber, I would say. These are the types of interconnected systems that I was really obsessed with. Knowing that our policy environments have the ability to impact resources, health, movement, and the rights of every person to live a self-directed life. That was what I was interested in. And I started working in health policy, but I hadn't yet embraced my own disabilities as a function of my political power and kind of political curiosity, right? I resonated with the rights of fisheries workers in Lake Victoria, but I had really strategically avoided integrating my political views into my personal history of disability, misdiagnosis and mistreatment in the medical system, and forced institutionalization. And I really believe that most of us have internalized ableism to this degree. I thought that, advocating for our disability and aging rights was in some way less radical. It was less important because I believe of the ways that care work has been feminized and thus marginalized in our culture. I didn't want to be associated with it. And when I started embracing a disability politic, I realized that ableism was truly the foundation of every inequity I had always sought to rectify in my political organizing and research.
So that's really pretty fundamental.
Yeah, it really started my, kind of the integration of those things into a career in disability policy and advocacy. And then in 2022, I was really at a turning point in my career. I wanted a role where I could resume some of my work in urban demography studies and supporting people's right to movement and migration, in addition to working for cross-disability liberation, rather than working within a single access issue area, as many of us do when working in disability studies. And Uber was looking for a policy leader who had experience in both areas. So it really
how unbelievable is that? Like,
it felt like destiny. It really felt like destiny.
What, it popped up on your LinkedIn feed or something? How did
exactly a cold application on LinkedIn?
Wow.
Right, and it just resonated so much with my my commitment to the right for people to move and migrate, the right to access their community and healthy, culturally relevant food, because I'm able to work back in food delivery now, and my belief that work should be flexible enough to accommodate shifting access needs, and also just really fundamentally embedded in mutual support of community members. And so all these passions are really the foundation of my work at Uber.
And who would have guessed? But as you trace that path for me, it is really interesting that one of the ideas that you're emphasizing is that aging is fundamentally an access issue, which I must admit, I never framed it that way. So this is really interesting. So what changes when we stop thinking about older adults as a senior market and start thinking about whether systems around them actually allow them to move, connect, and participate? That's a big reframe.
Yeah. And I think accessibility is really directly relates to everything that you talk about in this podcast and in your work. Accessibility is fundamentally about independence. It's about safety and self-efficacy. And these are elements of independent life that we navigate with various rights and ease in the second and maybe third quarter of our lives. And then many of us are surprised as we age that systems limit our independence, our ability to rely on them predictably, despite still, wanting and deserving independence and autonomy.
So dig a little bit deeper into this one term that you used, self-efficacy. I hear that as the confidence that we can interact fairly predictably with our environment. But why does this predictability issue become so important as we age?
Yeah, I love this term. I love the term self-efficacy. I love talking
yes, you use it a lot, so I'm noting it.
I use it a lot.
I'm adding it to my longevity lexicon that I'm always collecting.
Yes, it really changed my life. I feel like it changes my life every time that I talk about it and think about it. Self-efficacy refers to self-belief. How do I know that the world is going to behave the way I believe it should when I walk out my door?
Never does, Briana. The world is not behaving the way we think.
Right. And so how do I know that I have agency and choice and the degree of freedom that I want to with a set of predictable variables that might shift and change? But how do I have that self-belief to interact with those shifting variables around me? And self-efficacy is always important to us. It's just that many people don't have to think about it a lot, right? In our second and third quarters, I think especially, or in our middle age, through most of our adult lives, the lack of predictability in our environments are their anecdotal barriers or their crises, right? A storm that impacts our environment suddenly, or an illness or an unexpected family change that suddenly impedes the way that we navigate the world. And then as we age, systems that we used to interact with easily suddenly feel less reliable, right? They're not designed for us, or the things that we used to feel free to do feel restricted, either by the functionality of our bodies, new financial constraints, and certainly assumptions that people put on us. And so, self-belief and self-trust that we can navigate our world freely, slowly, or suddenly gets smaller. And many people have never had to navigate this before. So they haven't developed the resilience patterns necessary, or they might lack the resources. Without self-belief, without self-efficacy, we can lose independence because we start embodying what might be a structural loss of access. If we don't believe the world will allow for our freedom, we stop wanting to leave our front door and venture into the world. It has a dramatic impact on our independence.
So we internalize it as our own problem, not a systemic external issue.
Absolutely. It becomes our belief.
That's pretty damning. Mm-hmm. And it's also a little bit of an intergenerational tension, because families are often framing aging around protection and safety of their older family members, while the older folk are hungry for autonomy and independence. How do you think about balancing these two instincts?
Yeah, classic balancing act. We see it in aging communities as well as in disabled communities. So there's a few ways that I've come to think about this in my work. I mean, firstly, we should not acknowledge that every person, in fact, I might say every living thing, balances the degree to which they can be safe and protected within their need for independence. Yep. Right? We make these judgments all day, every day. It's just that the variables that we're weighing are relatively fixed in our everyday lives, right? Most of us aren't considering hitchhiking or skydiving every day. We're gauging like, how many seconds we have to cross the street or whether or not to meet up with that relative stranger we met on a dating app. That's us navigating safety while achieving independence. And so as we age and variables change, our capacity to estimate the degree to which we will be safe in part also varies because it can change quickly. And we also might be hanging on to an old story about how safe we'll be or feel reluctant to shift our ideas of how independent we can be. And I think this is where caregivers, of older family members, as well as in the disability community, can slip into what I and others have called an overprotect and neglect continuum. This is something we talk about in the disability field a lot. It happens a lot in institutions and policymaking. It can happen in families, communities, and in technology. So on the one hand, we're so desperate to protect our older loved ones that we can overbalance, right? And shift away from protecting the rights and the human need for autonomy of the people around us.
Yeah, absolutely.
And on the other hand, we have neglect. Okay, so as caregivers, we can neglect calls and signs for the need of independence, and we can neglect real functional needs because we're so focused on safety. And that tension can entrench itself in a family dynamic to the point where I think where older family members, their need for autonomy can supersede their own perceptions of safety because it becomes so much greater in the face of external restrictions.
You break the spirit to protect the body.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. And then that causes it can cause fluctuation on that continuum when aging family members aren't getting that independence that we need. And in the disability community, when we talk about autonomy in this way, we talk about the dignity of risk and how well-meaning people often strip others of the dignity of taking appropriate risks just because they're contending with variables that we might not have to navigate. And so we don't understand the context of how to be safe.
Same is true for children. We do the same thing to our kids that we do to our older.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And we watch parents as they navigate that. And then we watch parents as they navigate that with their older family members. And it becomes paternalism, as we know.
Yeah.
Because we start to, even unintentionally and in well-meaning ways, strip others of the dignity of risk because we don't know how to slow down and navigate from a harm reduction perspective, navigate difficult conversations where we have to be really honest about self-protection and interdependence and how to weigh what's important to us, and also how to give up control where there's so much sentimentality, so much emotion involved in the ways that we feel like we need to protect others.
So I think that's a fantastic and fascinating framework. So we got the concepts, and it's interesting to me because I always try and actually distinguish aging from disability, because I think bundling those two things up often makes people think that older people are disabled, which is not necessarily where we want to go. But how would you respond to that? I mean, I'm always very conscious of what we bundle together.
Well, I think of aging and disability similar in some ways because I don't think of disability certainly as a negative, and I also don't think of disability necessarily as a limitation. It's a creative opportunity, right? Whenever we have restrictions in our environment, that is a real creative opportunity for us to explore and do something differently. And so as we age and our variables shift and change, I think the way that you talk about aging is this creative expansiveness into kind of frontier areas that didn't exist before because they didn't need to exist before. And that's also what disability is. When we have access needs and when we talk about access needs, we're not thinking about disability from like a lack or a limitation. And we don't always need to think about it functionally. The social model of disability is not about impairment. It's about, to what degree is my environment framed around the need that I have to interact with the world around me. And that's absolutely what aging is. So I think if we think about the social model of disability of like, has my environment been set up successfully or can I set up my environment successfully in a way that supports my best life? And if it has not been, and if you cannot achieve that, that is a disability. That's not a negative about you. And it also doesn't speak to personal impairment. That's about the world around you. That's environmental context, environmental disability, essentially.
Perfect response, and you're just showing up my own internalized ableism.
We all have it.
Take it. We all have it.
Yeah.
So I want to turn now to, so what is Uber doing with this longevity opportunity? And you have been telling me that they've recently launched a bunch of features designed for older adults, even though we can talk about the language around seniors, which is still evolving internally. Tell us a bit, what was the internal journey that got the company to start taking this demographic shift seriously?
Yeah. So last year in 2025, we launched an older adult specific product. We also launched a feature called Simple Mode, which really kind of strips away some of the complexities in the app that can benefit, older adults who might be using the technology for the first time. And it can benefit lots of people who might want to reduce kind of cognitive load, so that their executive function can be at its best. I think in general, this shift can be viewed as a signal, I believe, of the company's maturity, of Uber's maturity. Uber feels ubiquitous in our lives now, but we're hardly 15 years old, right?
I know, it's extraordinary. 15 years old. It's
how much can change over such a short period of time, and their global markets were nascent in most areas. We're still growing and expanding our offerings across all user and industry segments. And I think for a long time, internal teams knew we had a growth opportunity if we designed and marketed more explicitly to older adults. Teams had spent years running dedicated campaigns, social impact partnerships demonstrating our value, investing, researching alongside older community members. But there are always limiting factors, from other product priorities to, I think, the perceptions of external limitations, and also from a policy perspective. And yet slowly, our investments in intersecting areas really demonstrated viability. So, for example, we've leaned into designing for accessibility as a whole, and we've grown business segments in non-emergency medical transportation and complementing government-subsidized transit benefits. We also have an expanding profile and options and benefits for families. And we've grown in ways that we envision the needs of families as central to how we understand and organize our futures. I think there was, for some, a persistent belief that seniors weren't our user base, right? And that might be too difficult to change.
Yeah.
Right? That fundamental belief was something that needed to gradually change internally in our culture, as I think it does, in many kind of global tech companies' culture. And much of that was achieved by our research teams that guide product development.
You said something that applies, I think, to almost any company or service. When a large group of people aren't using your product, the answer usually isn't that they don't want it. It's that you don't really understand their needs yet. What does that reveal about how companies design technology?
Right. Yeah. If you're noticing that people aren't using what you're offering, and your conclusion is that it's a lapse of demand in that user group,
and that it's a growing segment in the world.
Yes, right. Like those should be some alarm bells about how you're basing decision making off your priorities. Now, when a company initiates design, there are practical reasons, of course, to limit who they're thinking of as a user base. It allows you to streamline UXR, pricing, marketing, geography, everything that goes into defining a value proposition and then becoming profitable. Yeah. And plenty of companies can stay in that place, continue to design for their user group. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. But when a company wants to expand and their products, their user base, when they want to grow, they need to be willing to take creative leaps outside of their assumptions. And at this point, I think many otherwise creative people get stuck in a causal fallacy. It can make for really uninspired design. I think we have a real creativity problem in tech these days because many technologists have stopped designing around what they believe are edge cases. They design for a predictable middle, and that stifles innovation. It obscures really creative ways that users might already be getting their needs met, with an insufficient product that hasn't been designed for them. And I think this gap is particularly notable in innovation for older adults. False beliefs about cost, utilization, social patterns, technology uptake. These are reinforcing patterns. If creators think older adults won't use their tech, then older adults don't use their tech. And the cycle's perpetuated.
Self-fulfilling. Yes, and I find people are generally it's so hard to imagine future selves and yourself as older, that all these young techies, I get it why they can't imagine what the older might want or need. They really, it is hard, I think, for all of us to imagine, especially as this segment keeps evolving and changing quite quickly.
Absolutely. And I think that's been, when I talk about the company's maturity, I also think about the maturity of our senior leadership we've had senior leaders identify the needs of the family and of older adults, taken out of the language of we're designing for our parents and reframed into the language of we need to design for my retirement. We need to design for where I am 5, 10, 15 years from now. That's a significant change for a company to go through when they stop thinking of the user that's different from them as the other and start thinking about it as themselves.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The route to change is through the self. What have you learned? What has Uber learned about older drivers that surprised you most? Whether it's safety, predictability, privacy, or the role of family. Any good anecdotes you want to share? Or good stats?
For sure. For older drivers or for all of our users?
Well, older riders first, perhaps. Let's start with the consumer side.
Right. There's so much interesting texture here about the way that older adults balance their needs when using rideshare. There are early studies that we've done that highlight older adult priorities, particularly as they intersect with the assumption needs of family members, present really fascinating design challenges that our teams are navigating. From a systems and policy perspective, the most interesting question for me that we'll navigate moving forward is, yes, there are everything that you mentioned. There are questions around safety, pricing, privacy, the role of the family organizer in the senior product. For me personally, I think about what constitutes a family. And this has come up a lot already in our research and our sort of user experience. Of course, there are some obvious variables to consider, right? What about extended family that lives across national borders, family that speaks different languages or uses different currencies? How do we build around that? And then what does that family look like when it's chosen and not inherited? Where do family systems become complex to the point where it nudges up against our ideas of, names and, inferences of family? And how does that interact with privacy and information sharing? And importantly, I come from a background that doesn't assume safety within a family network. Right. We know that family can be the site of financial abuse, loss of privacy. That has a unique impact on older adults. And we know that ways that people can lose safety and autonomy within family systems can be reinforced by technology. And I think, one of the most important roles in my work is to partner with external experts in the aging and disability community to inform these really difficult tensions. And we learn from users with lived experience and from people with systems expertise to drive these thoughtful decisions. So I think that in particular, as we conceptualize the role of the family and how they engage with Uber, is an exciting frontier space in Uber for us to define what safety and privacy looks like.
So maybe you can also just give me an overview, because in our initial conversation, you told me that Uber is often seen or perceived to be a rich world yuppie habit, when actually you're saying it's really a company of the global south. Can you just develop that a bit? Because I think it's one of the biggest perception shifts about the company I've heard.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as a global company that certainly in emerging markets and all over the global south, where we have, not just a base of users and drivers and couriers who have vastly different ideas about access, ideas about sort of language fluidity and how they interact with our platform, but also different layers within cities that they're navigating, different patterns of mobility that they're used to, different conceptions of what safety and community means. When you start to build that in to a platform, you end up with really a richness and also utility of how users are interacting with our service throughout the world. And I think that, the perception shift that I love to see happen in people's minds when I talk about our work is away from that idea of sort of the middle income, either US or kind of European-based user, to this globalized function. I think, individuals know Uber is there when you need a ride or some takeout, but we're also there when you are home alone with your sick kid and you can't leave to pick up some cough medicine, or when you're recovering and need a prescription delivered. We contract with fleets, manage logistics and freight. We organize couriers, packages, services, and personal shoppers all over the world. And, we fill gaps in public transport, particularly in areas where people are used to having to take pedestrian risks or have historically lacked access to transportation. I talked a little bit about non-emergency medical. We organize millions of trips to medical appointments every month, many in direct collaboration with insurers and healthcare systems that pay for transport, deliver on-demand wheelchair accessible transportation in dozens of cities, in many places for the first time that's ever been available. We complement paratransit schemes and really fill gaps when employment shifts for our earners and help millions of earners weather career changes and economic forces outside of their control. So Uber isn't just about ride hailing. I think Uber is fundamentally about the choices we have and how we get our needs met in our community.
You're completely rebranding the company, and it's it's like lifting the veil on this hidden side of this organization that I think many of us have never really heard about or thought about. So I think that's an interesting insight. And before we leave the case study side, I'd love to get a notion of the driver base, because flexible gig work has become such a major part of income for people in Q3 in their 50s, 60s, and beyond. What trends are you seeing there? Is that a big growth of your driver base as well?
Right. The research about platform work as people age into Q3 and Q4 is really exciting. I really love partnering with researchers in this way. We do see, right now we see similar proportions of older adult drivers as there are represented in non-driver workforce. So roughly 15% of our global driver base is over 50. And as you noted, studies have really found that older workers, including those approaching retirement, they turn to platform work because they appreciate the flexibility and autonomy that comes with being their own boss.
And what they mostly can't find in other organizations.
Absolutely, yet. Right? Absolutely. Yeah. And so there are a few pieces of this that I'm really interested in learning more about as we move further into this work. I think, I want to know about the experience of riders with older drivers, specifically when older riders take trips with older drivers. I think there's really interesting intersections and socialization that we can start to understand and in how that can drive feature changes on the platform. I'm curious about, older driver satisfaction and how they build satisfaction into the work. What choices are they making within that flexibility in order to drive satisfaction? Where do older drivers experience trust in our company and in their own perception of safety, and how do they navigate those choices? And of course, I'm also curious about the vast socioeconomic impacts of our driver base and an older driver base, right? Like, what's their perception of independence and interconnectedness and socioeconomic mobility? How long do they stay in the workforce? How does platform work impact the receipt of Social Security benefits, for example? And also, I believe, how it might be changing geographic demography, meaning choices that older workers make and are able to make about where they live and how long they live there.
Yeah, because I imagine there's a huge range of these kinds of statistics over countries. And I imagine in Japan, you have a lot of much older drivers than you might in India, for example.
Sure. And so cultural expectations of older drivers, this is, I think, one of the benefits of really this globalized company and working with our global teams, because there are cultural insights about the ways that older riders and drivers might be experiencing our platform that might be really different than the way that we're experiencing them as builders and, policy thinkers in the US. And yet, as we're thinking about expanding offerings for our driver base, we have such a rich tapestry to learn from because of the different cultural experiences that are already happening on our platform globally.
Well, I would be just as curious as you about all the data that you're sitting on. I think it'd be absolutely fascinating. Many PhDs will be written on this, I feel, in the years to come. Let's zoom out a little bit to the whole concept of the future of mobility and this growing idea of age-friendly cities. Because listening to you, Uber starts to sound less and less like a ride-hailing company and much more like a fundamental logistics layer inside cities themselves and city planning. So how do you see this mobility platform contributing to these age-friendly communities of the future?
Yeah, I think age-friendly communities, they're not just places where people can walk to their community center and pharmacy. Right? They're places where we can...
That is a little bit the current perception.
Currently, and I don't think, and I don't mean to diminish that goal, because I think that we've made significant strides in our understanding of what social interconnectedness can mean and what kind of daily mobility patterns mean for longevity and healthfulness for sure. But when we pull back and really understand aging as independence, safety, self-efficacy, dignity, autonomy, and the interdependence, right? Policymakers building age-friendly communities ultimately, I believe, should focus on choice. Where can we build meaningful options that meet people's needs for inclusion without sacrificing safety, quality, privacy, and the dignity of risk and choice? People don't want one option. We never want one option. That doesn't change as we get older. We want a range of options for how we can get our needs met. And I think it's our role, both I think a privilege and a responsibility at Uber, but also I think for policymakers to contribute to the meaningful choices that people have in their lives to access their communities now and as our users age.
Well, and it's an amazing gift in dense cities like the one you and I live in, is to be able to do without a car now because all these services that have come up that are so flexible. So it's interesting, too, that because there's a gap between how policymakers are still debating and seeing Uber through the lens of debates from a decade ago. Where do you think cities misunderstand most the role that services like this can play in their fast-aging societies?
Uber has become a part of the fabric of everyday life for so many people, right?
Certainly for me, I gotta say.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's mobility insurance for everybody, whether you want to own the personal car or your car breaks down and you have to get to work, or, for people who commute home late and the bus that brings you that last mile home has stopped running and you've historically had to navigate that, that last mile walking on your own and determining whether that's safe for you. These essential functions that Uber enables are about meaningful choice. I think rideshare has created this network of meaningful choices in cities and towns around the world. And I think honestly that is the missing piece that policymakers misunderstand about aging.
Yeah.
I do think there's a big opportunity to recognize what mobility and delivery can mean for aging community members, and particularly where social benefits play a role. Everyone makes trade-offs of their time and energy, and as people age, these trade-offs are critically impacted by money and health in a way that can dramatically impact longevity. If I want to get to my family member's birthday dinner, but I no longer drive at night, that decision has a ripple effect that potentially impacts family well-being, safety, interconnectedness, and has a time cost. And also, if my pharmacy is a 5-minute walk away, but I don't have the energy to leave the house today, then proximity for the purpose of social connectedness isn't helpful. That's potentially harmful. And so understanding rideshare mobility and delivery as a function of meaningful choice is essential for policymakers that want to design aging community members, and understanding the role that Uber can play here. For example, in the US, we partner with thousands of healthcare organizations to deliver millions of trips a month in non-emergency medical. Our approach saves time and money, fosters really ease and dignity that meaningful choice engenders. And we want aging communities everywhere to benefit from that.
Yeah, I mean, the gift of independence that you give, that people don't have to rely on family members getting involved if they've figured out how to simply use an app, is huge. And I want to end where we started, actually, because I think that's so much a part of the bigger philosophical idea that you raised, is your suggestion that disability may actually provide one of the most useful frameworks for understanding aging. Now you're really flipping my own thinking on its head. So what's the disability movement taught you about longevity that the mainstream aging conversation still hasn't fully absorbed, and I'm including myself in that?
Yeah, we really have all been trained, but I have such a lighthearted approach to when people start to interrogate these own questions. As I said, throughout my career, I really had to counter my own ableism. I still do. It never leaves. We've all been trained by society to internalize pretty degrading beliefs about our own bodies as they experience disability and aging.
Yep.
Normativity is explicitly and subtly valued because normativity produces a predictable labor force, among other things. And if we believe our bodies are intrinsically less valuable, desirable, acceptable if we have access needs or limitations, we're going to be a lot more motivated to keep producing normatively and to not talk about it when we have a shifting access needs. And for many disabled people, we learn early in our lives and repeatedly that if we're going to find value and meaning in our lives, it's going to be outside of normative ideas of success and achievement. So our bodies and minds, they do not operate consistent with expectations, reinforced in our culture, our media, in the workplace.
I can certainly vouch for that.
Right. And so we started asking ourselves hard questions really early on of like, what does it mean to have a body that doesn't fit into a system's expectations? What do we do when a system isn't designed for us? How do we build meaning, family, community? How do we learn to find ourselves desirable, find ourselves worthy of love and sexual attention? How do we learn to navigate our bodies and minds with other people when it all feels off script, off of a normative script? And what's emerged from the disability community and answers to this is, it's adaptivity, it's ingenuity, it's resilience. It's all those things. It's radical activism for the inclusion of disability rights, but it's also truly a reconceptualization of our bodies and minds as fundamentally expansive and creative beings. Our worthiness and our capacity for connection, our desirability as disabled people, they're intrinsically beautiful. They're ecstatic in ways that go so far beyond normative scripts. Those scripts really start to look very small and somewhat ridiculous. And when you realize that your body can experience shifting meanings, disability, aging, instead of looking at as a restriction, you can truly view that as a creative opportunity, right? Like, what else is possible? What else could I be? And this is consistent with so many of the questions I've heard expressed by your guests on this podcast. Like, what if we all started asking these questions earlier? What could I be if we went off script? And so, I think as people want to prepare for a third and fourth quarter where they uncover the true expansive possibilities in their bodies and minds, they can do that alongside us in the disability community. We have some answers. We love to learn. And you're welcome here, right? We're welcome here. We love to.
We'll all be disabled one day. Let's prepare.
Absolutely,
yep.
Absolutely. And the way that we navigate that in our younger lives, even with temporary disabilities,
yep.
Injury, illness, pregnancy, and even as I was saying, being disabled by your own environment, whether that's, if you show up in the airport and you can't find the signs for where Uber is, or you can't get your family there quickly without your kids having, a bit of a tantrum. That's a structural disability. The ways that we think about disability, I think, can really shift if we understand it from that social model.
Briana Gilmore, I want to thank you for joining us, for reframing some of our old frames, but also I think I'm Uber. You're helping me rebrand the company just by knowing that you're in there doing some really, really interesting work. And I look forward to revisiting with you over the next few years when some of that data starts flowing into your research set.
Oh, Avivah, I'm beaming. It's such a privilege to talk to you. Thanks so much for inviting me today. And I also really look forward to continuing the conversation.
Fascinating. Talk to you soon. What I found compelling in this conversation was the conceptual shift Briana offers. She takes aging out of the category of decline and puts it into the category of design. If independence, dignity, and self-efficacy are what matters most as people age, then the real question isn't what older people can no longer do. It's whether the systems around them still support their agency. That's a powerful lens. And it also turns Uber into a far more interesting case study than many of us might assume, certainly me. This isn't only a story about ride-hailing. It's a story about meaningful choice, family dynamics, flexible work, access to healthcare, and the logistics of everyday autonomy in a long-life world. What Briana adds to the longevity conversation is a fresh and necessary invitation to learn from disability thinking, from the social model of disability, and from communities that have long understood how much freedom depends on design. I'm Avivah Wittenberg-Cox, and we are living our 4-quarter lives. For more thinking about the impact of our 4-quarter lives, you can read my column at Forbes and subscribe to my Elderberries newsletter on Substack. Let's design lives that aren't just longer, but better.